The hospital corridor smelled of antiseptic and fear. Charles sat rigidly in the uncomfortable plastic chair, his hands trembling as he watched the double doors that separated him from his daughter. Kate had been rushed into emergency surgery 3 hours ago, and every minute felt like an eternity. The fluorescent lights above buzzed with an irritating persistence, matching the anxious rhythm of his heartbeat. He remembered the phone call that had shattered his ordinary Tuesday afternoon. Kate had been in a terrible car accident. His 23-year-old daughter, vibrant and full of life just that morning, now fought for survival behind those sterile doors. Charles had dropped everything at his office, not even bothering to shut down his computer or inform his secretary. He just ran. Now sitting in this waiting area, surrounded by other worried families, Charles felt more helpless than he had ever felt in his entire life. His marriage to Camilla had been rocky for the past 5 years, but nothing compared to the terror of potentially losing his child. Kate was from his first marriage to Elizabeth, who had passed away from cancer when Kate was only 7 years old. He had raised Kate mostly on his own for 6 years before meeting Camilla at a business conference. The relationship with Camilla had started well enough. She was sophisticated, successful in her own career as a corporate lawyer, and seemed genuinely interested in building a family with him and Kate. But over time, cracks began to appear. Camilla grew increasingly resentful of the close bond between Charles and his daughter. She would make subtle comments about Kate being too dependent on her father, about Charles being unable to let go and allow his daughter to become independent. Charles never understood this jealousy. Kate was his flesh and blood, his connection to Elizabeth and the most important person in his world. He had tried to balance his love for both women in his life, but it never seemed enough for Camilla. She wanted his complete attention, his unwavering priority, and she saw Kate as competition rather than as a stepdaughter to embrace. The automatic doors at the entrance whooshed open, and Charles glanced up reflexively. An elderly couple entered, looking as worried as he felt. They took seats across from him, holding hands tightly. Charles looked down at his own empty hands, wishing he had someone to hold on to right now. He had called Camilla immediately after arriving at the hospital, but she had been in the middle of an important deposition. She promised to come as soon as she could wrap things up. That was 2 hours ago. Charles checked his phone again. No new messages. He wanted to be understanding about her work commitments, but deep down, a small voice whispered that if Camilla truly cared about Kate, she would have dropped everything just as he had. But he pushed that thought away. This wasn't the time for such reflections. Right now, all that mattered was Kate pulling through. A nurse emerged from the double doors and Charles jumped to his feet, his heart racing. But she walked past him to the elderly couple, speaking to them in hushed tones. Charles sank back into his chair, disappointment washing over him. The waiting was torture. Not knowing was torture. The last conversation he had with Kate replayed in his mind on an endless loop. It had been that morning over breakfast. She had been excited about her new job at the marketing firm, telling him about a creative campaign she was developing. Her eyes had sparkled with enthusiasm as she described her ideas, and Charles had felt such pride watching her. She had grown into such a remarkable young woman, despite all the challenges life had thrown at her, Dad. "You're not even listening," she had teased him, throwing a small piece of toast in his direction. "I am listening," he had protested with a laugh. "You were talking about the social media strategy for the organic food company." "That was 5 minutes ago," Kate had said, shaking her head with amusement. "I've moved on to the problems I'm having with Daniel from accounting." Charles smiled at the memory now, though tears threatened to blur his vision. He would give anything to hear her complain about Daniel from accounting again. He would listen to every word, every detail, and never let his mind wander for even a second. The automatic doors opened again, and this time it was Camilla. She strode in wearing her tailored navy suit, her heels clicking authoritatively against the linoleum floor. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her expression was one of controlled composure. She spotted Charles immediately and made her way over to him. "Any news?" she asked, her tone businesslike rather than comforting. Charles shook his head, unable to trust his voice. He gestured to the empty chair beside him, and Camilla sat down, placing her leather briefcase at her feet. She didn't reach for his hand. She didn't put a comforting arm around his shoulders. She simply sat there, checking her phone occasionally, her presence more obligatory than supportive. The deposition ran longer than expected, Camilla said, after a few minutes of silence. Jenkins wouldn't stop objecting to every single question. It was absolutely exhausting. Charles nodded but said nothing. How could he respond to complaints about a deposition when his daughter was fighting for her life? He knew Camilla's work was important to her, but the disconnect between her priorities and his felt like a chasm in that moment. "I'm sure she'll be fine," Camilla added, almost as an afterthought. "Kate is strong. She's a survivor." The words were meant to be reassuring, but they fell flat. There was no emotion behind them, no genuine concern. Charles felt a wave of loneliness wash over him, even though his wife sat right beside him. He had never felt more alone in his life. Another hour crawled by. Camilla made several phone calls, speaking in hushed but animated tones about her cases. Charles heard fragments about appeals and settlements, but the words meant nothing to him. His entire world had narrowed to those double doors and whatever was happening behind them. Finally, a doctor emerged. He was a middle-aged man with kind eyes and tired shoulders. He scanned the waiting area, and his gaze landed on Charles, who had already risen to his feet. "Mr. Hartford?" the doctor asked. "Yes, that's me," Charles said, his voice hoarse from lack of use and suppressed emotion. "My daughter, Kate Hartford." "How is she?" The doctor's expression was carefully neutral as he approached. Camilla stood up as well, positioning herself slightly behind Charles. The doctor glanced at her briefly before focusing on Charles. "The surgery went well," the doctor began, and Charles felt his knees nearly buckle with relief. "We were able to repair the internal injuries and we've stabilized her condition. She's not out of the woods yet, but she's a fighter. The next 24 hours will be critical." "Can I see her?" Charles asked immediately. "She's in recovery right now and heavily sedated," the doctor explained. "But once we move her to the ICU in about 30 minutes, you can sit with her. Just be aware that she's hooked up to various machines and monitors. It can be overwhelming to see at first." "I don't care about the machines," Charles said firmly. "I just need to be with my daughter." The doctor nodded understandingly and gave Charles's shoulder a brief sympathetic squeeze before walking away to attend to other matters. Charles felt tears finally break free, streaming down his face as the fear and tension of the past hours released in a flood of emotion. Charles sat in the uncomfortable chair beside Kate's hospital bed, holding her hand gently as if it were made of delicate glass. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor provided a strange sort of comfort, each beep confirming that his daughter was still with him, still fighting. Her face was pale against the white pillow, and various tubes and wires connected her to machines that hummed and blinked in the dimly lit room. He hadn't left her side for 6 hours now. A nurse had brought him coffee twice, but both cups sat untouched on the small table beside him, growing cold. Camilla had stayed for an hour before announcing she needed to go home and get some rest. She had kissed Charles briefly on the cheek, barely glanced at Kate, and left with promises to return in the morning. The night stretched long and lonely. Charles found himself talking to Kate in whispers, sharing memories from her childhood, telling her about things happening at his office, anything to fill the silence and let her know he was there. The doctors said she might be able to hear him, even in her unconscious state, and Charles clung to that possibility. "Do you remember that summer we went to the beach house?" he murmured, his thumb gently stroking the back of her hand. "You were 9 years old and you insisted on building the biggest sandcastle anyone had ever seen. We worked on it for 3 days. You had such determination even then." A tear rolled down his cheek as he remembered Kate's triumphant smile when they had finally completed the elaborate structure, complete with towers and a moat. She had been so proud, so full of joy. That had been their first real vacation after Elizabeth's death, and it had been healing for both of them. Around 3 in the morning, Kate's hand twitched slightly in his. Charles sat up straighter, his heart racing with hope. He watched her face intently, looking for any other signs of consciousness, but there was nothing more. Still, that small movement gave him encouragement. She was in there, fighting to come back to him. Dawn broke slowly, pale light filtering through the hospital room's single window. Charles felt exhaustion weighing down his bones, but he refused to leave. He had dozed off briefly around 5, his head resting on the edge of Kate's bed, but jerked awake moments later in panic, needing to confirm she was still breathing, still stable. The morning brought a change of nursing staff. A kind woman named Rosa came in to check Kate's vitals and adjust her IV. She smiled warmly at Charles. understanding in her eyes the devotion of a parent refusing to abandon their child. "You should get something to eat," Rosa suggested gently. "There's a cafeteria on the second floor. I'll stay with her and I'll call you immediately if anything changes." But Charles shook his head. "I can't leave her. I need to be here when she wakes up." Rosa nodded, not pushing further. She had seen countless parents in this same position, and she knew that nothing she said would make them leave their child's side. Around 8 in the morning, the door opened, and Camilla walked in. She looked refreshed, having showered and changed into a different outfit. A cream-colored blouse and black slacks. She carried a paper bag from a coffee shop. "I brought you breakfast," she said, extending the bag toward Charles. "A bagel and fresh coffee. You need to eat something." Charles took the bag mechanically, though he had no appetite. "Thank you," he managed to say. Camilla looked at Kate for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "Has there been any change?" "Her hand moved a little during the night," Charles said, unable to keep the hope from his voice. "The doctor said that's a good sign." "That's good," Camilla replied, but her tone remained neutral. She pulled up another chair and sat down on the opposite side of the bed. An awkward silence settled between them, broken only by the steady beeping of the monitors. Charles unwrapped the bagel but could only manage a few bites. His stomach was too twisted with worry to accept food. He sipped the coffee, grateful at least for the warmth and caffeine. "I have to be in court at 2, Camilla said after a while. "The Morrison case." "I told them I'd be there." Charles looked up at her, surprised. "You're leaving again?" "Charles, I can't just abandon my clients," Camilla said, a hint of defensiveness in her voice. "People are depending on me. Besides, there's nothing I can do here. She's unconscious." "She's your stepdaughter," Charles said quietly, struggling to keep his emotions in check. "Doesn't that mean anything?" Camilla's jaw tightened. "Of course it means something. But sitting here staring at her isn't going to make her wake up faster. At least one of us should be working, being productive." The word stung. Charles felt a flash of anger but pushed it down. This wasn't the time or place for an argument. Kate needed a calm, peaceful environment for healing, not tension and conflict. "Fine," he said simply, turning his attention back to his daughter. "Do what you need to do." The hours passed slowly. The doctor came by around 10 for morning rounds, checking Kate's charts and examining her responses. He seemed cautiously optimistic, noting that her vitals were strong and stable. Charles asked question after question, needing to understand every detail of her condition, her prognosis, what to expect in the coming days. Camilla sat through most of this, checking her phone frequently. When the doctor left, she stood up and gathered her things. "I'll try to come back this evening after court," she said. "Call me if anything changes." She left without waiting for a response, her heels clicking down the hallway. Charles felt relief wash over him once she was gone. As terrible as it made him feel, Camilla's presence added stress rather than comfort. Her impatience, her distance from Kate's situation, her inability to understand the depth of his fear and love for his daughter, it all created a barrier between them that felt insurmountable in these critical moments. Around noon, something changed. Kate's fingers twitched again, more deliberately this time. Charles leaned forward, his heart pounding. "Kate? Sweetheart, can you hear me? It's Dad. I'm right here." Her eyelids fluttered. It was barely perceptible, but Charles saw it. He stood up, moving closer, still holding her hand. "That's it, baby. Come back to me. You can do it." Slowly, painfully slowly, Kate's eyes began to open. They were unfocused at first, confused, trying to make sense of the bright lights and unfamiliar surroundings. Charles felt tears streaming down his face as he watched his daughter fight her way back to consciousness. "Dad?" The word was barely a whisper, rough from the breathing tube that had only been removed a few hours earlier. Yes, I'm here," Charles said, his voice breaking with emotion. "I'm right here, sweetheart. You're going to be okay." Kate's eyes found his face, and despite her obvious pain and confusion, she managed the smallest smile. Her hand squeezed his weakly. Charles hit the call button for the nurse, wanting the medical staff to know she was awake. But he never took his eyes off his daughter. This was the moment he had been praying for through the long, terrible hours. Kate was coming back. Rosa rushed in within seconds, followed quickly by another nurse. They began checking Kate's responses, asking her questions, evaluating her condition. Charles stepped back slightly to give them room, but kept hold of Kate's hand. maintaining that physical connection. The doctor arrived shortly after, and after a thorough examination, he declared it excellent progress. Kate was moved from critical to serious but stable condition. It was a significant improvement, and Charles felt a weight lift from his chest that he hadn't even fully realized he'd been carrying. Once the medical staff cleared out and Kate had been given something for the pain, she looked at her father with clearer eyes. "What happened?" she asked, her voice still weak. "You were in a car accident," Charles explained gently. "But you're going to be okay. You're safe now." Kate nodded slightly, then winced at the movement. "How long have you been here?" "Since they brought you in," Charles admitted. "I'm not going anywhere." 3 days had passed since Kate woke up, and each day brought small improvements that filled Charles with gratitude. She could sit up now with assistance, could eat soft foods, and could hold conversations without tiring as quickly. The bruising on her face had started to fade from deep purple to yellowing green, and while she still experienced significant pain, the doctors were confident in her recovery trajectory. Charles had barely left the hospital. He had gone home once, at Kate's insistence, to shower and change clothes, but he had rushed back within 2 hours. He had arranged for indefinite leave from his office, much to Camilla's disapproval. His assistant had been wonderfully understanding, handling everything that needed his attention and only calling when absolutely necessary. Camilla's visits had become sporadic and brief. She would stop by in the morning before work or in the evening afterward, staying for 30 minutes at most before finding a reason to leave. She brought flowers once, a generic bouquet from the hospital gift shop, which she placed on the windowsill without much ceremony. The contrast between Charles's devotion and Camilla's detachment had not gone unnoticed by Kate. Though she said nothing directly, Charles could see the hurt in his daughter's eyes each time Camilla left after a perfunctory visit. Kate had tried so hard over the years to build a relationship with her stepmother, but Camilla had always kept her at arm's length. On this particular afternoon, Kate was awake and alert, propped up in bed with pillows supporting her back. Charles sat in his usual chair beside her, and they were watching an old comedy show on the small television mounted on the wall. It felt almost normal, this quiet togetherness, except for the hospital setting and the reminder of how close Charles had come to losing her. "Dad, you really should go home and get some proper rest," Kate said during a commercial break. "You look exhausted." "I'm fine," Charles insisted, though he knew the dark circles under his eyes told a different story. "I'm exactly where I need to be." Kate reached for his hand and he took it gently, careful of the IV line still attached to her arm. "I'm not going anywhere," she said softly. "You don't have to worry so much. I'll always worry," Charles replied with a small smile. "That's what fathers do." They fell into comfortable silence, their hands clasped together. It was a simple gesture, but it spoke volumes about their relationship. They had always been affectionate with each other, even as Kate grew into adulthood. Hugs, hand-holding, kisses on the forehead. These were natural expressions of their bond. The door to the room opened, and Camilla entered. She was wearing a burgundy dress suit that Charles recognized as one she wore for important meetings. Her expression was tense, and she carried her briefcase rather than leaving it in the car as she usually did on hospital visits. "Hello," she said, her greeting directed more at Charles than Kate. "How are you feeling today?" This last question was aimed at Kate, though it sounded more obligatory than genuinely concerned. "Better, thank you," Kate replied politely. "The doctor said I might be able to move to a regular room tomorrow instead of ICU." "That's good news," Camilla said, setting her briefcase down. She glanced at Charles and Kate's joined hands, and something flickered across her face too quickly to identify. Charles noticed her looking at their hands but thought nothing of it. This was perfectly normal for them. He continued holding Kate's hand, his thumb absently tracing small circles on her skin, a comforting gesture he had done since she was a little girl having nightmares. "I can only stay for a few minutes," Camilla announced, checking her watch. "I have a partners meeting at 6. "Of course," Charles said, trying to keep the disappointment from his voice. Kate said nothing, turning her attention back to the television. Camilla pulled up a chair, but instead of relaxing into it, she sat on the edge, her posture rigid. She made small talk for a few minutes, asking about Kate's pain levels and whether the food had improved. But her heart clearly wasn't in the conversation. Her phone buzzed several times, and each time she glanced at it, her fingers twitching as if resisting the urge to check her messages. "Charles, I need to talk to you about something," Camilla said after a particularly awkward pause. "Perhaps we could step outside." "If it's about me, I'd rather you just say it here," Kate interjected, her voice steady despite the tension that had entered the room. "I'm not a child." Camilla's lips pressed into a thin line. "Fine, I think it's time we discussed your recovery plan. You'll need physical therapy, someone to help you at home for a while. We should look into hiring a nurse." "She's coming home with me," Charles said firmly. "I'll take care of her. She doesn't need a stranger." "And how long do you plan to be off work?" Camilla asked, an edge creeping into her voice. "We have bills to pay, Charles, responsibilities. Your office has been very understanding, but they can't function indefinitely without you." "My daughter nearly died," Charles said, his voice low but intense. "My work can wait." "This can't." Kate squeezed his hand, trying to diffuse the building tension. "Dad, she has a point. You do need to think about work eventually. I'll be okay. See? Kate understands," Camilla said, as if Kate had taken her side in an argument. "We need to be practical about this." Charles felt anger rising in his chest, but he pushed it down. Kate didn't need to witness a fight between him and Camilla, not while she was still recovering. He took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "We'll figure it out," he said finally. "But right now, Kate's recovery is my only priority." Camilla's jaw clenched, and for a moment Charles thought she might argue further. But instead she stood abruptly, picking up her briefcase. "I need to go," she said. "I'll call you later." She left without saying goodbye to Kate, without a comforting touch or word of encouragement. The door swung shut behind her, leaving a heavy silence in her wake. "I'm sorry," Kate whispered after a moment. "For what?" Charles asked, genuinely confused. "For coming between you two. I can tell it's causing problems." Charles squeezed her hand firmly. "You listen to me, Kate Hartford. You are not causing any problems. You are my daughter, and taking care of you is not a burden or an obligation. It's a privilege. Do you understand?" Kate's eyes filled with tears. "But Camilla and I will work things out," Charles said, though he wasn't entirely sure that was true. "That's not your concern? Your only job right now is to get better." Kate nodded, wiping at her eyes with her free hand. They sat in silence for a while, the television playing unwatched in the background. Charles could feel the weight of his marriage problems pressing down on him, but he refused to let it interfere with what Kate needed from him right now. That evening, after Kate had fallen asleep, Charles stood by the window of her hospital room, looking out at the parking lot below. His phone buzzed with a text from Camilla. "We need to talk when you get home. This can't continue." Charles stared at the message for a long time before responding simply, "Okay." He knew what was coming. The conversation they had been avoiding for years was finally going to happen. But tonight he was too tired to worry about it. Tonight all that mattered was that Kate was alive and healing. Everything else, including his crumbling marriage, would have to wait. He returned to his chair beside Kate's bed, settling in for another night of vigil. He took her hand again, careful not to wake her, and closed his eyes. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now, in this quiet moment, he had his daughter safe beside him, and that was enough. A week after the accident, Kate was moved from the ICU to a regular recovery room. It was a significant milestone, one that Charles celebrated quietly but with deep relief. The new room was larger, with a window that offered a view of the hospital gardens rather than the parking lot. There was a small couch that converted into a bed, where Charles had been sleeping instead of going home most nights. Physical therapy had begun, and watching Kate work through the pain of rebuilding her strength was both inspiring and heartbreaking for Charles. She approached each session with determination, even when tears streamed down her face from the effort. The accident had damaged her left leg significantly, and the doctors warned that full recovery would take months, possibly requiring a cane for a while. "I'm going to walk down the aisle at my wedding someday without limping," Kate had declared to her physical therapist on the second day. "That's my goal." Charles had smiled at her fierce determination, even as his heart ached for what she was going through. She was so much like her mother, refusing to be defeated by circumstances beyond her control. Camilla's visits had become even less frequent. She would text Charles with updates about why she couldn't make it to the hospital, citing work emergencies, traffic, exhaustion. Charles stopped expecting her, and he could see that Kate had stopped hoping for her stepmother's presence as well. On this particular evening, Charles was reading aloud to Kate from a mystery novel she had been enjoying before the accident. She was propped up in bed, listening with her eyes closed, a peaceful expression on her face. These quiet moments had become precious to both of them, a reminder that sometimes the simplest things in life were the most meaningful. The door opened, and they both looked up, expecting a nurse. Instead, Camilla entered, and Charles was struck by how different she looked. Her usually perfect hair was slightly disheveled, and there was a hardness in her eyes that he hadn't seen before. "We need to talk," she said without preamble. "Both of you." Charles closed the book, his stomach tightening with apprehension. Kate pulled herself more upright, wincing slightly at the movement. "What's wrong?" Charles asked, though he suspected he already knew. Camilla set her purse down and crossed her arms over her chest, a defensive posture. "I've been doing a lot of thinking over the past week. About us, Charles. About our marriage." "Camilla, maybe this isn't the best time," Charles began, glancing at Kate. "When is a good time?" Camilla interrupted, her voice rising slightly. "You're never home. You've been living in this hospital. I've been alone for days on end." "My daughter was in a serious accident," Charles said, trying to keep his voice calm. "Where else would I be?" "That's exactly the point," Camilla said. "It's always about Kate. Everything is always about Kate. Your time, your attention, your emotions. There's nothing left for me, for us." Kate's face had gone pale. "Maybe I should call a nurse, ask them to move me somewhere else while you two talk." "No," Camilla said sharply. "You need to hear this too, Kate. You need to understand how your dependency on your father is destroying our marriage." "That's enough," Charles said, standing up. His voice was quiet but firm. "Don't you dare blame Kate for the problems in our marriage." "Why not?" Camilla challenged. "It's the truth. She calls you for everything. She expects you to drop everything whenever she needs something, and you do it, every single time, without considering how it affects me." "Affects us. She's my daughter," Charles said, struggling to understand how Camilla could see Kate's presence in his life as a problem. "I would do the same for any child of mine. I would do the same for a child of ours if we had one." "But we don't have one," Camilla said bitterly. "And we never will, because you've made it clear that Kate is the only child you need or want." The accusation hung in the air. Charles remembered the conversations they'd had about having children together, how Camilla had wanted to start trying soon after they got married, how he had hesitated. Not because he didn't want more children, but because he had sensed even then that Camilla's desire for a baby was rooted in competition with Kate, rather than genuine maternal longing. "I never said I didn't want more children," Charles said carefully. "I said I wanted to wait until Kate was more settled, until we were more settled as a couple." "That was 5 years ago," Camilla shot back. "Kate is 23 years old. She's an adult. How much more settled does she need to be?" "Please," Kate said, her voice small and pained. "Please don't fight about me. Dad, maybe Camilla's right. Maybe I have been too dependent on you." "No," Charles said firmly, turning to his daughter. "Don't let her make you feel guilty for having a close relationship with your father. That's not unhealthy. That's not wrong. It is when it comes at the expense of everything else," Camilla insisted. "Charles, I need you to choose. Either you set some boundaries with Kate or we're done. I can't keep living like this, feeling like a third wheel in my own marriage." The ultimatum hit Charles like a physical blow. He looked at Camilla, really looked at her, and realized that he was seeing her clearly for perhaps the first time. This wasn't about Kate being too dependent. This was about Camilla's inability to accept that love wasn't a finite resource, that Charles loving his daughter didn't diminish his capacity to love a spouse. "You want me to choose between you and my daughter?" Charles asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "I want you to prioritize our marriage," Camilla corrected, but they both knew it amounted to the same thing. Charles felt a strange calm settle over him. The decision he had been avoiding, the truth he hadn't wanted to face, suddenly became crystal clear. He walked over to Kate's bed and took her hand, the same gesture that had started so many of these conflicts. "I choose Kate," he said simply. "I will always choose my daughter." Camilla's face flushed with anger and humiliation. "You're making a huge mistake." "No," Charles said, still holding Kate's hand. "I made the mistake 5 years ago when I married someone who saw my child as competition instead of as family." "Dad, no," Kate protested, tears streaming down her face. "Don't do this because of me. I'm not doing this because of you," Charles assured her gently. I'm doing this because it's the right thing. Camilla and we were never going to work. Not when she fundamentally misunderstands what it means to be a parent. Camilla grabbed her purse, her hands shaking. Fine, if that's how you want it. Don't expect me to be there when you come crawling back. I won't be, Charles said quietly. She stormed out of the room, the door slamming behind her with a force that made Kate flinch. In the sudden silence that followed, Charles sat back down on the edge of Kate's bed, still holding her hand. I'm so sorry, Kate whispered, sobbing now. This is all my fault. Listen to me, Charles said, using his free hand to gently tilt her chin up so she would look at him. None of this is your fault. Camilla and I had problems long before your accident. This just brought everything to the surface. But your marriage was already broken, Charles finished. I just didn't want to admit it. She's right about one thing. I do need to make a choice about what's important to me, about what kind of man I want to be. And I choose to be the kind of man who stands by his daughter, who doesn't abandon the people he loves when things get difficult. Kate threw her arms around him, careful of her injuries, and Charles held her as she cried. He felt sadness about the end of his marriage, but he also felt something else, something unexpected. Relief. The pretense was over. The uncomfortable middle ground he had been trying to maintain was gone. He could stop trying to make two incompatible people happy and focus on what really mattered. 2 weeks after Camilla's departure from the hospital, Charles found himself living in a strange new reality. He had moved back into the house he shared with Camilla, but only to pack his belongings. She had made herself scarce during this process, staying with a friend from her law firm. They communicated only through terse text messages about logistics and finances. Kate had been discharged from the hospital and was staying at the house temporarily, recovering in the guest room that had once been her childhood bedroom. Charles had converted it back, bringing out old photos and decorations from storage, trying to make her feel comfortable and loved during this difficult time. The physical recovery was progressing well, but Charles worried about the emotional toll everything was taking on his daughter. She blamed herself for the marriage falling apart, no matter how many times Charles reassured her that wasn't the case. She would grow quiet sometimes, staring out the window with a sadness that broke his heart. I ruined your life, she had said one morning over breakfast, pushing her scrambled eggs around her plate without eating. You gave my life meaning, Charles had corrected her firmly. Everything I do because you made me want to be a better man, a better father. It was the truth, but he could see that Kate struggled to believe it. The years of Camilla's subtle criticisms and cold treatment had planted seeds of doubt in Kate's mind about her worth, about whether she was a burden to those who loved her. Charles had found an apartment not far from Kate's own place, a simple 2-bedroom that would serve as his new home once Kate was well enough to return to her independent life. The lease would start at the end of the month. Meanwhile, he had filed for divorce, a process that Camilla's lawyer was making as difficult and contentious as possible. On this particular afternoon, Charles sat in his lawyer's office listening to the list of demands Camilla was making. She wanted half of everything, including the retirement account he had built up over 20 years, the vacation home that had belonged to his parents, even the car that Kate had given him for his 50th birthday. She's being vindictive, his lawyer Margaret said bluntly. None of these requests are reasonable and no judge will grant them. But it's going to make this process longer and more expensive than it needs to be. Charles nodded wearily. He just wanted it to be over. He wanted to move forward with his life, to focus on Kate's recovery and rebuilding their sense of normalcy. Do whatever you need to do, he told Margaret. I don't want to drag this out, but I'm not going to let her punish me for choosing my daughter. Margaret made notes on her legal pad. The house is in your name only, correct? You owned it before the marriage? Yes, Charles confirmed. I bought it when Kate was 10. It was never marital property. Good, that will help. And the retirement account. Most of that predates the marriage as well. We can argue for a much smaller division based on the actual duration of the marriage. They went over more details. And with each minute, Charles felt the weight of his failed marriage settling more heavily on his shoulders. He had tried. He really had. But love couldn't be forced and compatibility couldn't be manufactured. Camilla had wanted a version of him that didn't exist. A man without the deep parental bond that defined so much of who he was. When the meeting ended, Charles drove back to the house, dreading another evening of awkward silence and forced politeness with Kate. She tried so hard to act normal, to not be a burden, that it almost made things worse. He wanted her to feel free to be upset, to be angry, to express the full range of emotions she must be experiencing. He arrived home to find Kate in the kitchen, attempting to make dinner while still moving carefully on her healing leg. She had set the table for two, and was stirring something on the stove that smelled like his mother's old beef stew recipe. "You shouldn't be standing so long," Charles said, immediately moving to take over. "Let me finish this." "Dad, I need to do things," Kate protested. "I can't just sit around feeling useless." Charles heard the frustration in her voice and realized she was right. He had been so focused on protecting her, on doing everything for her, that he hadn't considered that she might need to feel capable and independent again. "Okay," he said, stepping back, "but I'm staying close in case you need help." They worked together in companionable silence, Kate cooking while Charles set out drinks and helped with small tasks. It felt good, normal, like they were finding their rhythm again. Over dinner, Kate finally broached the subject they had both been avoiding. "Have you heard from Camilla at all?" Charles shook his head. "Only through lawyers. I think that's how it's going to be from now on." Kate put down her fork. "Do you regret it? Choosing me over her?" "Never," Charles said without hesitation. "Kate, you have to understand something. What Camilla wanted wasn't a marriage. It was a competition. She wanted me to prove I loved her by loving you less. That's not how love works. Love expands. It doesn't diminish." "Mom would have understood that," Kate said softly, referring to Elizabeth. "Your mom did understand that," Charles agreed. "She used to tell me that the depth of my love for you showed her the kind of man I was, the kind of husband and father I could be. She never saw it as taking away from our relationship." Kate's eyes filled with tears. "I miss her so much sometimes." "I know," Charles said, reaching across the table to take her hand. "I do too." They finished dinner quietly, each lost in their own thoughts about the past and the uncertain future. After they cleaned up, they settled in the living room, Kate on the couch with her leg elevated and Charles in his reading chair. "What are you going to do once I'm back in my apartment?" Kate asked. "The house is going to feel empty." "I'm not keeping the house," Charles admitted. "Too many memories, and most of them aren't good ones. I found an apartment near your place. 2 bedrooms so you can stay over whenever you want." Kate smiled at that. "I'd like that. Maybe we can do weekly dinners like we used to before." She didn't finish the sentence, but Charles knew what she meant. "Before Camilla. Before everything got complicated, I'd love that," he said warmly. The rest of the evening passed peacefully. They watched a movie together, made jokes during the commercial breaks, and for a few hours they could almost forget about the upheaval in their lives. When Kate started yawning, Charles helped her to her room, making sure she had everything she needed for the night. "Dad?" she called out as he was leaving. "Yes? Thank you. For everything. For choosing me. For being here. For never making me feel like I was too much." Charles felt his throat tighten with emotion. "You could never be too much, Kate. You're exactly enough. You're perfect just as you are." He closed her door and stood in the hallway for a moment, taking a deep breath. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be difficult conversations with lawyers, the pain of dividing a life he had built with someone he once loved, the adjustment to living alone again. But he had Kate and she had him, and that bond would see them through whatever came next. That night, lying in bed, Charles thought about the moment in the hospital when Camilla had demanded he choose. At the time, it had felt like an impossible decision, a betrayal no matter which way he turned. But now, with some distance and clarity, he realized it hadn't been a choice at all. It had been a revelation of who he truly was and what truly mattered. He had chosen Kate, yes. But more than that, he had chosen to be a man of integrity, someone who didn't abandon the people he loved when it became inconvenient or when someone else demanded it. He had chosen to be the kind of father his own father had been, present and devoted and unwavering in his love. As sleep finally claimed him, Charles felt something he hadn't felt in years: peace. The pretense was over, the uncomfortable middle ground was gone, and he could finally just be himself, fully and completely. And that self was, above all else, Kate's father. It was the identity he was most proud of, the role he had always performed with his whole heart. Everything else was secondary. 6 months had passed since that pivotal moment in the hospital room when Camilla had demanded Charles choose. In that time, the world had shifted and settled into a new configuration that felt surprisingly more right than the old one ever had. The divorce was finalized 3 weeks ago. Camilla had eventually dropped most of her unreasonable demands when it became clear the judge wouldn't entertain them. She walked away with what she had brought into the marriage plus a modest settlement, and Charles kept the house which he had sold immediately afterward. His new apartment had become a real home. Kate had helped him decorate, bringing in plants and artwork, making sure the space felt warm and lived in rather than temporary. The second bedroom was designated as Kate's room, though she mostly stayed in her own apartment now that she had recovered physically from the accident. The emotional recovery had taken longer. Kate had spent several months in therapy, working through the guilt and self-doubt that Camilla's treatment had instilled in her. Charles had attended some sessions with her, learning better ways to communicate, to support without smothering, to love without enabling the insecurities that had taken root. Their relationship had emerged stronger for it. They had weekly dinners as planned, alternating between his apartment and hers. They talked on the phone several times a week. But Kate had also started building a fuller social life, dating again, spending time with friends, pursuing hobbies she had neglected during the years of walking on eggshells around Camilla. Charles had returned to work, throwing himself into projects he had been avoiding for years. His colleagues noticed the change in him, a lightness that hadn't been there before. He smiled more, engaged more fully in meetings, even accepted an invitation to join the company's softball team. He had started dating too, though nothing serious yet. Just dinner here and there with women who understood that his daughter was an important part of his life and didn't see that as a problem. It was refreshing to meet people who thought his close relationship with Kate was admirable rather than problematic. On this particular Saturday morning, Charles was in his kitchen making pancakes when his phone rang. It was Kate. "Morning, sweetheart," he answered cheerfully. "Dad, I have news," Kate said, and he could hear the excitement in her voice. "Good news, I hope." "The best news. Remember that marketing director position I applied for? I got it. They just called me with the offer." Charles felt pride swell in his chest. Kate had been working toward this promotion for months, putting in extra hours, taking on challenging projects, proving herself capable of the increased responsibility. "That's wonderful. I'm so proud of you." "Thanks, Dad. I couldn't have done it without your support, especially during the recovery. There were so many times I wanted to give up, but you kept believing in me." "I always will," Charles said simply. "So this calls for a celebration. Dinner tonight? Anywhere you want. Actually, I was thinking we could cook at your place, like we used to when I was growing up. I want it to feel special but personal, you know." Charles smiled, remembering countless Saturday nights in the old house, Kate helping him in the kitchen, music playing in the background, laughter filling the rooms. "I'd love that. What should we make?" "Mom's lasagna recipe," Kate said without hesitation. "The one with the 3 cheeses and the special sauce." They spent another few minutes on the phone, making plans and sharing excitement before saying goodbye. Charles stood in his kitchen afterward, looking around at the home he had built from the rubble of his failed marriage, and felt gratitude wash over him. That evening, Kate arrived at 6 with grocery bags full of ingredients. She moved around the kitchen with confidence now, no longer favoring her leg, no longer carrying the physical reminders of the accident. The emotional scars had faded too, slowly but steadily. They worked together preparing the lasagna, falling into an easy rhythm developed over years of cooking side by side. Music played from Charles's phone, a playlist Kate had made for him of his favorite songs from different decades. They sang along badly to the ones they knew, laughed at Charles's inability to remember any lyrics correctly, and enjoyed the simple pleasure of being together. While the lasagna baked, they sat at the small dining table with glasses of wine for Charles and sparkling cider for Kate, who had never been much of a drinker. "Can I tell you something?" Kate asked, her expression turning more serious. "Always," Charles assured her. "I've been thinking a lot about everything that happened. The accident, Camilla leaving, all of it. And I've realized something. As terrible as the accident was, as painful as everything with Camilla was, I think it needed to happen." Charles tilted his head, curious. "What do you mean?" "We were all stuck," Kate explained. "You were in a marriage that wasn't working, trying to keep everyone happy and making no one happy. I was trying to be small and invisible, not cause problems, not take up too much space. Camilla was fighting a battle she could never win because she fundamentally misunderstood what she was fighting for. Charles considered this. I suppose you're right. We couldn't have gone on like that indefinitely. The accident forced everything to the surface, Kate continued. It made you show Camilla who you really are, what you really value. And it made me realize that I don't have to apologize for having a father who loves me, who wants to be present in my life. You should never apologize for that, Charles said firmly. I know that now, Kate said with a small smile. Therapy has helped, but also just seeing you happy, Dad. Seeing you in this apartment that you chose, living a life that fits you instead of trying to squeeze yourself into someone else's vision of who you should be. It's been healing for me to watch. The timer went off and they retrieved the lasagna from the oven, the cheese perfectly golden and bubbling. They served themselves generous portions and returned to the table. This is perfect, Charles said after his first bite. Just like your mom used to make it. She would be proud of us, Kate said softly. Of how we've handled everything. Of how we've taken care of each other. She would be especially proud of you, Charles said. Look at everything you've accomplished. The new position. Your recovery. The work you've done on yourself. You're an amazing woman, Kate. Kate's eyes glistened with tears, but they were happy tears. I had a good teacher. You showed me what it means to be resilient. To prioritize what matters, to not compromise on the important things. They finished dinner in comfortable conversation, discussing Kate's new responsibilities at work, Charles's upcoming project, plans for the holidays. It was normal and ordinary and absolutely perfect. After dinner, they cleaned up together, and Kate prepared to leave. At the door, she hugged her father tightly. Thank you for choosing me, she whispered. Charles held her close. Thank you for being someone worth choosing. Though honestly, it was never really a choice. It was simply seeing clearly for the first time what had always been true. Kate pulled back, smiling. I love you, Dad. I love you too, sweetheart. Congratulations again on the promotion. After she left, Charles stood in his apartment looking at the photos on the wall. There was one of Kate as a baby with Elizabeth, one of Kate's high school graduation, one from last month of the two of them at a baseball game, both grinning at the camera with hot dogs in hand. His life hadn't turned out the way he had planned. His marriage to Camilla had failed. He was starting over in many ways at an age when he thought he would be settled. But looking at those photos, at the evidence of the relationship he had prioritized and preserved, Charles knew he had made the right choice. In a silent plea, he had grasped Kate's hand that day in the hospital, and Camilla's voice had cut through demanding he release it. But he hadn't released it. He had held on, choosing love over ultimatums, choosing authenticity over appeasement, choosing the bond that had sustained him through every difficulty life had thrown his way. And in the end, that choice had set them all free. Camilla was free to find someone who could love her the way she needed, without competing loyalties. Kate was free to live without guilt, to embrace her place in her father's life without apology. And Charles was free to be exactly who he was, a devoted father first and foremost, with room in his heart for other relationships but never at the expense of the one that mattered most. He picked up his phone and sent Kate a quick text. Thank you for being my daughter. Thank you for making me a father. It's the greatest honor of my life. Her response came quickly. Thank you for being the kind of dad every child deserves. I won the lottery with you. Charles smiled, set down his phone, and felt a contentment that had eluded him for years. The future was uncertain, as it always was, but he faced it with clarity and peace, knowing that whatever came, the foundation of his life was solid. Kate was thriving, he was happy, and the bond between them was stronger than ever. Sometimes the hardest choices were the simplest ones. Sometimes love demanded that you hold on when others demanded you let go. And sometimes, in grasping a hand in a silent plea, you saved not just the person you were holding but yourself as well.